In April, my Epidemics, Hate and Compassion from the Plague of Athens to AIDS was published. It would be incorrect to say that this book would have been impossible without digital humanities and the steady stream of documents to have come online since the beginning of this century. When I began the project in 2009, I envisioned it principally based on archival sources, early printed books, and microfilm collections of newspapers. This vision changed rapidly. Had my original plan persisted, the book's parameters would have been narrower, yet would have required greater travel, time, and money. As it stands, the book sweeps through 2.5 millennia of history, and with the 19th century becomes a global history. A word of caution. The digital humanities employed by this project is of the most elementary sort. Through various strategies of double keyword searches, I zipped through online collections of letters, diaries, poetry, history, imaginative literature, and thousands of newspapers. I then waded through the masses of false positives and recorded the hits illustrating emotional reactions to diseases that then form my databases. In short, I read documents as opposed to relying on machine-generated scattergrams and charts as with Google Ngrams of relative word frequencies. Nonetheless, this elementary use of digital humanities made it possible to ask new questions about a consensus in the history of medicine concerning emotional responses to epidemic diseases over the long term that has remained uncontested among journalists, political pundits, and those at the forefront of social, intellectual, and medical history. To take a few examples, the late Enlightenment Danish-German statesman and scholar of antiquity, Berthold Georg Niebuhr, proclaimed in 1816, "Times of plague are always those in which the bestial and diabolical side of human nature gains the upper hand." In a famous article in 1952, René Becquerel reasoned that epidemics induce class hatred. Such emotions were part of our structure mentale, constance psychologique. With the rise of AIDS in the 1980s and into the 21st century, such pronouncements mounted. According to the brilliant Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, the prodigious trauma of great pestilences intensified the search for a scapegoat on which fears, hatreds, and tensions could be discharged. The medical sociologist and historian Dorothy Nelken and Sandra Gilman claimed, "Blaming has always been a means to make mysterious and devastating diseases comprehensible." Roy Porter concurred with Susan Sontag. "Deadly diseases, especially when there is no cure to hand and the etiology is obscure, spawn sinister connotations." And more recently, from earthquake-racked, cholera-stricken Haiti, physician, anthropologist, and Harvard University professor Paul Farmer concluded, "Blame was, after all, a calling card of all transnational epidemics." One trouble with these pronouncements is that they have relied on a handful of examples only. These usually include the Black Death, 1347 to 51, the Great Pox of the 16th century, several cholera riots in the 19th century, and AIDS centered almost entirely on the US experience in the 1980s. In addition, these judgments were largely ahistorical, without any attempt to investigate change over the long term. However, some of these statements, such as the ones above by Nelken, Gilman, and Porter, suggest an implicit change. If epidemics' sinister connotations were more likely when diseases were mysterious, without cures to hand, then those before the epidemiological breakthroughs of the early 19th century, followed by the laboratory revolution of the 1870s, should have been the ones more likely to trigger hatred. And these reactions should have declined steeply during the 19th century. Having previously studied the Black Death and the burning of Jews, I began with the question of change. From online sources and those available only in print or manuscript, I found surprises. So back to the history of hate and disease was more nearly the opposite of what we should have expected from the secondary literature. Epidemics of hate increased in the 19th century, first with cholera across Europe, Asiatic Russia, and into Japan and the Americas. Then with smallpox, especially in North America from the 1880s well until the 20th century. And finally with plague in the Indian subcontinent, China, and to some extent elsewhere in the first decade of the 20th century. For instance, I found 72 major riots sparked by fears of smallpox in the US alone. These clustered from the epidemic of 1881 to around 1910. That is, after this disease had become a custom one with a widely practiced and effective preventive measure, vaccination. By contrast, epidemics in antiquity that sparked scapegoating, division, or collective social violence of any sort were extremely rare. For instance, the surviving books of the Roman historian Livy describe 57 outbreaks of epidemics. While Livy rarely described the signs or symptoms or epidemiological patterns of these diseases, he paid attention to their socio-psychological consequences. Yet in not a single case does he or any other ancient writer describe these epidemics spurring collective violence or blaming peoples. Instead, the epidemic effects were the opposite, inducing the Romans to end class hostilities between senatorial classes and plebeians and against warring tribes. In place of hate, plagues led Romans to donate supplies of grain and medical remedies to their enemies. In addition, the most mysterious diseases to perplex priests and physicians were the ones to move individuals and governments to greater charitable activity and acts of abnegation. These diseases demanded consultation of sacred books and oracles, and these, instead of calling for beggars to be cast out or others persecuted, asked ancients to open their doors to strangers, remove the manacles binding prisoners, grant work-free holidays, provide grain for the poor, and invent new forms of hospitality open to all, even slaves. Of course, there's no denying the Black Death's repercussions with deadly violence to priests, beggars, and the near extension of Jewry in its principal centers down the Rhineland into France and Spain and eastward into present-day Poland and Austria. In fact, no other pandemic or epidemic in world history can compare with its levels of social violence. Yet few historians have commented on the emotional ramification of subsequent plagues through the late Middle Ages to around 1530. Instead of deadly onslaughts on minorities being a case for generalization, the Black Death was a colossal exception. No other plague of the 14th century or the Renaissance led to mass violence against Jews or any other. As with epidemics in antiquity, the opposite was more often the case, as seen in 1399-1400, when plague spread through most of Europe, with mortalities rebounding to levels not experienced since the 1360s. It spawned a mass reaction, which, instead of dividing communities as the Black Death's flagellants had achieved, brought societies together with a peace movement called the Bianchi. Its followers united across city walls, factions, class, and gender, and for the duration of the plague successfully ended conflict, from legal squabbles between peasants to inter-regional warfare between territorial states. Even with the rise of hate and suspicion with early modern plagues, when in some places supposed plague spreaders, the untori or engrasseurs, were tortured and put on trial, there was no return to the Black Death horrors. Those executed in places such as Milan during the plague of 1630, famously portrayed in Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, numbered in the teens, not the tens of thousands, as happened across wide swathes of Europe from 1348 to 1351. Moreover, trial transcripts, chronicles, letters indicate that those targeted in these early modern trials were more often insiders, ranging from well-heeled native-born artisans to bankers, rather than Jews or other outsiders. As surprising as an indifference to historical change may seem, more startling from a medical history perspective is scholars' seeming indifference to the types of disease as a factor driving social violence or compassion. My book concludes with a phrase which may strike you as a truism hardly worth repeating. Just as different diseases affect our bodies differently, so too they have affected differently our collective mentalities. Yet from the present literature, it appears historians and social scientists of medicine might disagree with this proposition. For the purpose of this talk, I will concentrate on the emotional histories of two diseases, cholera and influenza. Their striking differences in reactions, I contend, cannot be reduced simply to differences in context of political regimes or economic conditions. First, cholera, on its first grand tour of Western Europe in the 1830s, provoked hundreds of riots, galvanized crowds in the thousands. Despite different contexts, such as fears in the British Isles over grave snatching and murder to supply the appetites of the expanding anatomy colleges for corpses, or the political upheavals of the July monarchy in France in 1830, or the crisis of the Bourbon monarchy in Italy, coinciding with the spread of cholera, a specific pattern of conflict fueled by similar fantasies underlay cholera's social violence across strikingly different political landscapes, from Asiatic Russia to the Americas. Unlike later smallpox riots in North America, the principal protagonists of cholera rioting were the poor and marginal, such as Irish Catholics in Glasgow and Liverpool, Asiatic Sarts in Tashkent, and impoverished women and fishermen in Puglia. While the butts of blame were elites, doctors, surgeons, and pharmacists, along with state officials, from local police to regional governors, believed to be engaged in a grandiose Malthusian plot to ease population pressures by killing off the poor. Moreover, neither these fantasies nor their violence ended with the first mysterious European wave of cholera. In Russia and Italy, they may have even become geographically more widespread and with greater destruction later. In Italy, collective violence during its first cholera epidemic, 1836-7, was limited almost entirely to Sicily. by cholera's last major wave in 1910-11, riots spurred by the same accusations of doctors purposely poisoning the poor had raced through the southern mainland on both shores and reached places in central and northern Italy, such as seaside resorts north of Rome, Crescenzano near Milan, towns of the Tuscan Garfagnana, resorts south of Genoa, within Genoa itself, and by some reports, Venice. In Russia, in 1892, to take just one example, cholera myths moved workers in present-day Donetsk to riot, and after mowing down Tsarist and Cossack troops sent to suppress them, they completely destroyed this industrial town, from its factories to its churches. On the other hand, I know of no epidemic of influenza to produce mass rioting or collective violence of any sort, despite its lightning contagion. Instead, its most catastrophic strike, the great influenza of 1918-20, was a pandemic of compassion in places as diverse as El Paso, Philadelphia, villages of the Australian outback, Dublin, Mumbai, Cape Town, and others. A wave of mass voluntarism ensued, staffed by students, workers, nurses, businessmen, and other elites, and especially by women, who crossed ethnic, religious, class, and racial boundaries to sweep floors, make meals, care for children, and nurse the dangerously ill. Such acts of organization and abnegation cut across international lines, as with women from Canada traveling to the eastern seaboard of the US to nurse flu victims. And when the pandemic reached Ontario, women from the US readily reciprocated, while fully realizing that their courage might end in death. The voluntarism even crossed enemy lines, as at the Alpine German-speaking village of Zofingen, when a large cohort of local ladies and girls, not my language, converted their school into a hospital to care for enemy French soldiers stricken by the flu. After the armistice, the captain of the German troops in the region wrote a letter in French to La Gazette de Lausanne commemorating the sacrifice and internationalism of these peasant women, several having died from their altruism. Of course, not all have seen the great influenza as blameless, believing that naming was in and of itself the same as blaming. The names Spanish flu, La Española, La Gripe Espagnole was evidence that Spaniards, individually and collectively, were held responsible for spreading the flu, and presumably discriminated against or assaulted for it. However, thousands of newspapers across numerous countries, from large metropolitan cities to small towns in the British Isles, France, Italy, the US, Canada, India, and Australia, cast doubt on this assertion. I have not found a single incident of a local population assaulting, even verbally, any Spanish person or group for causing the influenza. Instead, small-town newspapers of the Deep South and Midwestern America argued that this pandemic neither began in Spain nor hinged on Spaniards as the spreaders. Instead, the unprecedented movement of troops, including their own, determined the unusually rapid spread of this flu. And certainly, these patriotic papers in these jingoistic times had no intention of blaming their own troops. Others have gone further in an attempt to squeeze the great influenza into what is conceived as the universal pattern of big epidemics. In a book that has gone through several reprintings, John Barry sought to ferret out details of the great influenza's supposed persecution. His harvest, however, was meager. In places, health officials placarded the houses of the infected. In Arizona, a citizens committee deputized a special police force and called on citizens to enforce anti-influenza ordinances such as wearing masks. But these municipal regulations failed to spark collective violence or discrimination of minorities. By Barry's account, the only group to suffer physical harm from authorities were dogs, shot because they were thought to be flu spreaders. Even here, as far as Barry's evidence goes, it happened only in one small Kentucky town. Yellow fever is another epidemic disease that challenges a traditional coupling in the historiography. Fear and panic meant blame and violence. As measured by levels of mass evacuation, no epidemic disease in American history can compare with yellow fever for inducing panic as seen at Philadelphia in 1793, New Orleans in 1853, Memphis in 1878, and many smaller towns across the Deep South throughout the 19th century. Yet instead of tearing societies asunder, as had cholera and smallpox, yellow fever proved to be a unifying force, attracting northern money and volunteers to the Deep South, spurring elite clubs and businesses to supply makeshift wards, transport doctors, and donate drugs free of charge. And blacks risked their lives nursing the afflicted, who were overwhelmingly impoverished, recently arrived white immigrants. These waves of abnegation, moreover, sprouted in historical contexts unconducive to such sentiments, as with the Southern pandemic of 1853, when sectional tensions between North and South were on the rise leading up to the Civil War, or in 1878-9, during a racist backlash against the advances of post-Civil War Reconstruction, Jim Crow legislation, and a steep rise in lynchings. Finally, the few threats of violence sparked by yellow fever came late in the day, at the end of the 19th century, and with yellow fever's U.S. finale in 1905. That is, after this disease enigma of transmission had been solved and effective preventive measures introduced. Beyond my book, Digital Humanities may help address new questions of a multivariate nature. For instance, cholera riots may have crossed Asiatic Russia to America, but certainly did not occur everywhere, even in places with the highest rates of mortality, as at Bilston in the West Midlands in 1832. On the other hand, the highest mortalities and greatest devastation of any place in the British Isles occurred at Sligo in 1832. And I don't think historians have really pointed this out. When you go to the literature, Bilston is all over the place, but actually it was much higher in Sligo. With mass migration coupled with mortalities of a quarter of the remaining population, only 1,000 in this city of 15,000, by one estimate, they vary, were left at the end of the year. Yet here, there were at least 2 significant cholera riots. How do we explain the differences? And why did cholera riots virtually cease in the British Isles and France after the first European cholera pandemic in the 1830s, but continued and even expanded geographically in Russia and Italy into the 20th century? At this point, my explanations have relied on examples. Berlin is a rare case when the failure of cholera violence to materialize made the news. With cholera riots in Königsberg, Stettin, Memel, and smaller towns in Prussia, the king intervened in Berlin, modifying strict quarantine rules that threatened laborers' livelihoods. Berlin's middle classes and health departments also played a role, establishing new charitable organizations, soup kitchens, and providing clean hospitals and care. In short, Berlin practiced what would become commonplace in the US with outbreaks of yellow fever in the 19th century, and with influenza across the world in 1918. As a result, cholera rioting never afflicted Berlin, despite the return of the disease in parts of northern Germany, such as Hamburg, and with accompanying collective violence until 1892. A counterexample comes from the small cathedral town of Ostuni in Puglia. From the first cholera rave in Italy to its last major one, local authorities here prohibited non-elites from performing their traditional burial rites, visiting afflicted friends and relations, and viewing the bodies of loved ones before burial, while elites were allowed to bury theirs in traditional church grounds. Such class-based impositions fanned fears of doctors and the elites out to cull populations of the poor, seeing their relatives unceremoniously thrown into the ditches of newly created cholera graves. The popolo of Ostuni rioted in 1837. But the city's class-based burial restrictions continued. And in 1910, the city's collective violence exploded beyond any of its previous incidents. 3,000 in a town of 18,500 wrecked the cholera hospital, liberated the patients, burnt down the town hall and health department, took possession of the central square, attacked health workers, stoned the carabinieri, and destroyed doctors' homes. For reasons not commented upon by any newspaper, Ostuni's elites, unlike Berlin's middle classes, appear never to have learned cholera's lessons. As historians are aware, collecting data on non-events is a difficult exercise. How can we be certain that cholera did not occur in certain towns or cities? From an English doctor's memoir written in 1832, 2 cholera riots surfaced at Exeter in that year, with the usual pattern of marginal groups and laborers accusing doctors of inventing the disease and using drugs to kill off the poor. Yet searching online newspapers have found no cholera riots in Exeter. As Ruth Newman has argued, newspaper coverage, especially by local papers, of cholera and its riots was problematic. Consensual news blackouts were agreed on to protect the town's reputation and commercial interests. These problems of information could become worse over time with developments in state censorship. For example, from my first searches in online papers, few cholera riots appear in Italy in 1910-11. I was ready to conclude that Italy had by then learnt its lessons on instilling trust among impoverished populations of fishermen, fig growers, women, and children, and that the charitable traditions of the new nation state, seen with cholera waves in the 1860s and 1880s, had continued apace into the 20th century. I was wrong. Instead, turning to the physical copies of newspapers stored at libraries in Milan, Florence, and Rome, I discovered 26 descriptions of serious cholera riots 1910 to 1911, the majority of which presented the same patterns as seen in 1836-7. In addition, some articles mention further places of cholera so-called troubles, but without reporting them. The differences in these findings resulted from a self-imposed censorship by newspapers in 1910, and then followed by Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti's official censorship in 1911. Hard copies of Rome's Il Messaggero, Naples' Il Pungolo, and many other Italian newspapers reveal that the censorship had been incomplete. Papers bypassed the censors only by dispensing with certain key words, such as cholera, Cholera, and quarantena, and lazaretto. It's as though they were already anticipated that Sam Cohn would come around and use the computer with keyword searches. For cholera, cases of gastroenteritis, acute enteritis, or even suffering with serious conditions were substituted. Quarantine was conveyed by expressions such as le persone contumaci, and cholera hospitals were labeled case contumaciali. No doubt, and never after was these words used. No doubt, archival researchers and police records will uncover further cholera riots in these years. Another multivariate question that my book confronts, but with examples only, is estimating what were the epidemic diseases or what characteristics of them most likely led to social violence. And very few historians have asked this question, surprisingly, but one has. First, I agreed with Margaret Humphreys. Childhood diseases and those that were endemic, despite being big killers, were not prone to ignite blame or hatred. Instead, those that struck suddenly and disappeared quickly were the socially dangerous ones. This conclusion, however, certainly isn't fail-proof. After all, America's socially most toxic disease, smallpox, was an endemic disease with epidemic outbreaks, and children, more often than adults, were its victims. The same goes for poliomyelitis, which in an epidemic of 1916 was blamed on the poor, ethnic minorities, and victims of the disease and their mothers. As for diseases that struck fast and vanished rapidly, the theory works with cholera and plague, but plague after 1348 and into the 16th century provoked no riots or social loathing. Moreover, with modern plague, collective violence was confined mostly to India and the years 1896 to 1902, well before plague reached its heights in the subcontinent. Other epidemic diseases also rose and disappeared quickly, such as yellow fever and the great influenza, which in many places wrought its havoc within a month. Yet these failed to spark mass violence or social victimization of the disease victim. My verbal modeling went on to discuss other diseases and disease characteristics, such as ones that could kill in a matter of days or even hours, as with plague, cholera, yellow fever, and the great influenza in many cases. Or to discuss of signs and symptoms with leprosy, smallpox, and yellow fever, or high levels of contagion, which might or might not provoke hatred and violence. One disease characteristic, I argued, more consistently than any others accompanied blame and violence, rates of lethality, and certainly not rates of mortality. Here, the history of cholera can be tied to recent experiences of Ebola in West Africa, even though the first is caused by a bacterium and the second a virus. Through the 19th century and in Russia and Italy into the 20th, cholera's rates of lethality remained extraordinarily high, at 50% and sometimes more than that. around the same rates witnessed with Ebola in West Africa in 2014-15. With both diseases, this lethality sparked repeated claims by victims' friends and families, quote, "Here, if the people come into the hospital, they don't leave alive." And for both, these suspicions led to deadly consequences for doctors, health workers, and police. In addition, with cholera and Ebola, as well as plague in India, anger arose when health workers tried to disrupt traditional rituals of dressing and burying the afflicted. Yet, as the recent history of Ebola in West Africa has shown, along with examples in my book stretching from Mumbai's slums to Louisiana's bayous, relations between authorized health boards and the communities of victims determined the likelihood of social violence erupting. When communities were allowed to negotiate and participate in measures such as search parties in India and funerals elsewhere, the rioting and assassinations ended. Even with contemporary economic modeling, these important variables of tradition, trust, and degrees of negotiation are difficult to quantify. For the historian, they are doubly difficult. First, we must discover these non-events when violence or blame did not make headlines. Can digital humanities help guide us in collecting such shadowy, difficult to pin down figures by keywords? Thank you.
Thank you.